Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope you're having a great, productive, fun time at this summer school. I'm very happy to be here with you. And first, I would like to thank Sumay for inviting me to participate today and for her hard, thoughtful work in organizing these sessions, as well as ECPS for providing the space for us to meet. So about the lecture, as you know, this afternoon our lecturer is Professor Sergei Guriev, who is a world-renowned academic and economist, who is interested in political economy, development economics, labor mobility, and contract theory, and who has been the provost at Sciences Po since last year, and has previously been the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as well as a member of its executive committee. Professor Guriev is also known for his strong opposition to the Putin regime in Russia and to its invasion of Ukraine, and he has also written about modern media-savvy dictators and their methods for staying in power, including the distortion of information and the faking of democratic procedures in his recent book with Daniel Treisman, Spin Dictators. Today, Professor Guriev will discuss his recent work on the rise of populism, and especially a recent article with Elias Papaioannou, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, called The Political Economy of Populism, which was published on the Journal of Economic Literature last year. Taking a distinctly economic approach to populism, the article synthesizes a large chunk of recent literature on the success of populist political actors in Europe and the Americas, focusing on the ideational approach to populism proposed by Kazmuda and other researchers, and based on the understanding of populism as a thin ideology. The article looks into the definition of populism, its history, its relation to cross-border trade, automation, the 2008-9 global financial crisis, some current political trends, including the lack of trust in institutions and migration, the importance of digital communication and social media platforms, and also discusses some implications of the rise of populism. So if you can, I'd like to ask you to keep your cameras on, and I turn the session over to you, Professor Guriev, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jose. I don't think I need to speak anymore because we've already covered everything I wanted to say. Indeed, this is a presentation based on our survey of political economy of populism, a survey published in the Journal of Economic Literature. This is the leading journal of surveys in economics. It is indeed a survey written by economists. We are political economists, but we're still economists. It is a multidisciplinary survey in the sense that we cover not only literature in economics, but also in quantitative political science and sociology. We cover mostly the literature which came out recently, so it's a 100-page paper covering about 300 papers and books, most of which 250 came out since 2016. So it's an overview of recent literature. And while the paper was published in 2022, we stopped writing it in 2020. So please don't judge me for not mentioning research which is more recent than that. There is a section on COVID actually, but there is much more research which came out in the last couple of years that is covered there. So in 40 minutes that I have and 39 minutes that I have, I won't be able to cover everything in detail. So my job today is actually to encourage you to read this survey. The survey is written in a accessible non-technical language, and it goes through several themes mentioned by our moderator. So first and foremost, these are the 4 questions that should interest us. At least that were the questions that I was interested in to start with, and basically the definition and the measurement of populism. Second, the causes of the recent rise of populism, cultural or economic or interaction of the two. Is that due to one-off events or long-term trends? Have information communication technologies played a role? And then the implications. And then if implications are not good, and if populism is a problem, should we do something about it, and how we can address this challenge? And I would like to mention that on the fourth question, we don't really have much to say, but I have some ideas and some speculations. Before going there, I would like to say that indeed I work not only on populism, but also on democracies. And I would like to mention this book that just came out in its second edition called Spin Dictators, which covers the new generation of autocrats. We wrote it together with Daniel Treisman, who is a political scientist, not an economist, based on several papers we've written together in recent years. And basically, what I'm going to say just right away, that not all spin dictators are populists, and not all populists are dictators and non-democratic leaders. So these are different subjects. But some people who are featured in this survey are also people who featured in this book. Anyway, so since you're in a summer school on populism studies, you already know this, but just to give you an idea, 2016 was a very important year for populism. People started to write and read about populism a lot. The trend of looking at populism was already there. The number of articles covering populism and populists on Factiva, which is a data set of media articles, was growing in the first decade of 21st century as well. But it was a real jump in 2016, 17, and 19 after Brexit referendum and Donald Trump election. The same is true in Google searches. These are relative numbers, so other news have overtaken populism in 2017-18, but 2016 was a big year for populism. And academics also started to take notice. There was some growth in populism, in research on populism, but it was a jump in 2017-18. Of course, it takes time to write an academic article. So if you look at article at JSTOR, there was also a jump, pretty much doubling and even tripling the number of articles devoted to populism. So indeed, defining populism is not easy. And many people want to use different definitions. Some people think that definitions are not useful because, as Barry Eichengreen, economic historian, says, referring to Supreme Court Justice Stewart's definition of pornography, I know it when I see it. And this is what general public believes, that we know populists when we see them. However, it is important to have a strict criterion, because I want to make sure that we can measure the rise of populism, and therefore quantify its rise, and also do a quantitative analysis of what caused populism to rise and what the implications were. For that, we need numbers, and for numbers, we need strict definitions. So before recent rise of populism, economists would always use definition by Dornbush and Edwards. There's a famous book about macroeconomic populism in Latin America. And there is a definition of Latin American macroeconomic populism, which is approach to economics that emphasizes growth and redistribution and de-emphasizes macroeconomic risks. And so that applies, of course, to left-wing populism in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century, that goes for promises which are not sustainable because macroeconomic constraints still matter. And you can still find populism like this around some countries. We mentioned Turkey today. Erdogan, until very recently, would pursue unsustainable macroeconomic policy. And you also have some parties in Southern Europe who advocate this. But actually, most modern populists are different. And indeed, we are using the definition by Kasmude, the ideational approach, where populism is not an ideology, but it's actually a view of the world, which considers the society divided into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, pure people and corrupt elites. What is important is homogeneity also matters because you don't need checks and balances. All people are the same, and their commonalities are more important than their differences. And also, you don't need too many people to represent you. If everybody is the same, one single leader can represent every good person. So this view of the world immediately implies that society should be run by the people and not by the elites. So that means that populists can be left-wing, right-wing, or center, or no clear position of left-wing, right-wing scale. But what matters is indeed this anti-establishment sentiment and this homogeneity sentiment. So essentially, this definition has two features: anti-elitism, pure people versus corrupt elite, and anti-pluralism. So why is that important for economists? Because if you have anti-pluralism and anti-elitism, you're against checks and balances, you're against separation of power, you're against independent regulators. And essentially that means that you undermine the institutional foundations of economic growth. And that's why the populists are very often unable to deliver economic benefits that they promise. And I'll show you some data on this. So how do we measure populism? It's not a trivial question because, well, first and foremost, to classify populist party is not easy. You can use binary measures, continuous measures. So famous CHESS project, Chapel Hill Expert Survey, gives you an anti-establishment score of 1 to 10. And we discussed that in the paper, of course. Most people actually use 0-1 definition, saying this is a populist party, this is not a populist party, and just produce lists of populist, non-populist parties. Interestingly, these lists are very correlated. And basically, even before 2016, those classifications would give you about 50 populist parties in Europe. And this, some authors disagree on certain classifications, but mostly this is the same classification. Now, when you measure the rise of populism, do you need to count share of votes or share of seats? When you look at the sample of countries, do you look at parliamentary presidential regimes? How do you calculate averages? Do you do weighted average? Do you weigh by population? Do you weigh by economic variables? All of that is not trivial. And then, of course, how do you handle changes in borders? None of that is easy. But the two approaches which are usually used are either vote share or 0-1 measure if the populist party is present in the government. So these are the most common measures. So on this slide, I'll show you the populist vote share in Europe using different populist party classification. And there is a paper that we wrote with Jan Algan, Elias Papagiannou, and Evgenia Passari. There is a populist party classification from Timbro think tank called populistindex.com. There is a so-called Guardian project, Rudine and co-authors, and our own paper, which was published in 2021. I'll show you data from that. But basically, all these things show you that in Europe, in the first decade of 21st century, there was slow growth. And then in the second decade, it was really fast growth in populist parties' vote share. These are numbers weighted by size of population of countries. And basically, at each particular year, we use the vote share of the populist parties in the last election. And so you see that the first decade is an increase from something like 5 percentage points. And the second decade, it's more like 10 percentage point increase. So the second decade was really, really fast increase. This is another measure which I think is important. It's a measure of share of populists in power. So this is a paper by Funke, Shularik, and Trebesh, who look at 60 large countries, which account for 95% of global GDP. And then they classify populists, and they look if at any given moment this populist party is in government or not. And basically, in 2018, you see that 26% of their sample had populists in government. 26% of 60 countries, it's actually 16 countries. So it's quite a bit of countries, quite a lot of countries. And this is the historical maximum by far. Even in the 1930s and 1950s, you won't have as many. And also what you can see that if you look at the growth since 2000, you see that the major growth was right-wing populism, even though we have quite a few left-wing populist governments. So this is important to just mention that we live in unprecedented times. We've never had so many populist voters and so many populist governments. So basically, this is just summarizing what I just said. Whatever measure you use, 21st century is unprecedented period, especially the last 10 years. So let me briefly talk about the drivers of populism. We already mentioned what they are: long-term trends of globalization and therefore competition with imports from cheap labor countries, low-wage countries, technological change, automation. Both trends leave people behind. Also, global financial crisis 2008-2009. That was also an important shock. It was a one-off shock. Now, what is good about economic factors? We know how to fight populism if populism is due to economic factors. Just to give you an example, the recent global financial crisis left a lot of people behind. Austerity aggravated the situation. There are papers which show that austerity caused a rise of populism. And basically, if you believe in this, you can say you need to be more generous during the crisis. And that's exactly the lesson which was learned before COVID crisis or during COVID crisis. Western countries spent a lot of money and so avoided additional rise of populism. So it's a typical example where economic factors can be taken into account and the problems can be addressed by economic tools. Culture is much more difficult. In culture, you have cultural backlash against what's called silent revolution, against postmodernist values, against the rise in protecting minorities and women. And so basically there's a loss of status, loss of prestige by middle-aged white men who want to go back in time. And so this is a typical cultural backlash that may emerge. Another issue could be identity, and that may be linked to immigration. And I'll talk about this, but basically in terms of immigration is a one-off factor, especially in 2015-16, Syrian refugee crisis, and also a long-term trend. I'll show you data on this. As transportation costs go down, the number of immigrants from developing to developed countries is growing. And finally, as we mentioned, there is an issue of mobile broadband, internet, and social media. And that also creates a problem. Basically, the problem with the non-economic factors is it's very hard to address them. On immigration, the results are actually very nuanced and solutions exist. But let me go one by one. So basically, economic drivers: globalization promotes growth, actually helps fighting global poverty. It has worked really well in terms of pulling hundreds of millions of people in India and China and other developing countries out of extreme poverty, but it creates winners and losers. And if national governments don't compensate the losers, you actually have a major backlash against globalization. And so Trump comes out and says, we need to fight against Chinese imports and protect workers who lose jobs if Chinese imports are growing. You have technological progress, which promotes economic growth as well, but also creates winners and losers. And again, here gains also accrue to the rich, and so inequality increases. Global financial crisis, it was also interesting, again, because it originated elsewhere, so you couldn't blame cosmopolitan, footless elites and footloose, ruthless elites. And so it's, again, something that can give you the opportunity to support populist anti-establishment drivers. Now, one thing which I would like to mention about globalization and automation, these are, first and foremost, these are things which are related to each other. It's very hard to separate the two. Why? Because globalization promotes technical change. If you operate in a global market, it pays off to invest in research and development, because if you increase productivity, if you create a new product, you now sell to a bigger market, and so incentives to invest in research and development are stronger. So globalization promotes R&D and technical change. Vice versa, technical change promotes globalization because R&D reduces transportation costs, creates a global market for services, increases mobility, increases circulation of ideas and knowledge-intensive products. So these things are really connected to each other. What is important in both cases is they promote inequality. They destroy jobs in the middle of skill distribution. These are routine blue-collar jobs or routine white-collar jobs. High-skilled, knowledge-intensive services are actually benefiting from globalization. So scholars, engineers, doctors, lawyers benefit. Well, artificial intelligence may change things, but still at the moment, knowledge-intensive services see creation of jobs and increase in salaries. Low-skilled services are less affected because these jobs are very cheap, and it's hard to manual services are hard to automate. But basically, what we see is that both of those things result in labor market polarizations, and both of those things result in increase in populist vote share, both in the US and in Europe. And so there are papers on all of those. I'm just giving you a couple of examples. Now, the impact of the global financial crisis, we forgot this global financial crisis because after that we had refugee crisis, COVID, the war, the 2022 war in Ukraine. And of course, it's not the first war. It's actually after 2014 invasion. The 2014 invasion was less impactful, but still. So in any event, it was a short crisis. The policy response was quick, except for some countries where there were austerity policies, which also contributed to populism. But in general, when you have something which is short, it's easier to measure the impact, and that's why you have so many studies of the global financial crisis. It was also very acute. So global GDP and Western GDP was hit in a way that we've not seen since the Great Depression. So it's a very clear-cut case where you can study a one-off shock. And basically what we find in our paper with Ian Algan and Evgenia Passari is when you look at subnational regions in Europe, in 26 European countries, you see that unemployment changed between before and after the crisis, changed a lot, and the change was highly heterogeneous. In some countries, there was no change. In some countries, the change was 10 or 20% in some regions. And then what we can actually see the causal impact of this increase in unemployment rate at the subnational level and increase in populist vote share. And to identify causality, I can go on this, but we really identify the causal effect, and basically the increase of increase in regional employment due to the crisis implies one-for-one increase in populist vote share. So if your unemployment in your region goes up by 10%, populists get 10%. Interestingly, we find that the blame for the crisis is attributed to European and national politicians. No change to trust to other people, local government, United Nations, police, church. No impact. The real impact was on trust in national and European political elites. So this is a chart from our paper where on the horizontal line this change in the unemployment rate before and after the crisis. On vertical line, change in vote share for populists, and colors represent parts of Europe. Blue is Southern Europe. As you can imagine, that's where increase in unemployment was the largest. We also do the same exercise for Brexit. We find exactly the same thing. So change in unemployment rate in electoral district in the UK implies a change in vote share for Brexit. So change in unemployment was a very, very important thing. So since I don't have much time, let me jump to non-economic explanations. As I mentioned, there are many. You talked before this lecture, you talked about Eastern Europe. In Europe, you can talk not only about immigration, but also about emigration. Roughly speaking, Central and Eastern European countries are losing a population, and many of them worry that their culture will be forgotten, that there will be too few. And so that is also an issue. It's not actually well proven that quantitatively there is not easy to establish a link between immigration and identity concerns. On immigration and identity, I'll talk about this. On silent revolution and cultural backlash, this is an issue of going back 50 years when Ronald Inglehart wrote a paper in a book about silent revolution. Silent revolution is the generational change in values, where younger people now are more tolerant of minorities and more committed to gender equality. And so this revolution continued for about 50 years. And then people who saw, roughly speaking, majorities or privileged minorities who saw that they're losing prestige and power, they voted for populists in 2016. So why now is not easy to answer, because all these things are long-term. And people would talk about the economic trigger of economics crisis. When you suddenly see a great increase in unemployment, you start blaming the other. You start worrying about identity. If you lose your job yourself, you start talking about identity issues. Or it could be a one-off event like a refugee crisis. So just to show you this, this is what Pew Research Center does, looking at which issues are more salient for Americans. And you see how in the second decade of the 21st century, suddenly in the US, immigration has become a big issue. So it's really something which was very, very recent and unusual. That was a one-off shock. And of course, BLM also means that racial relations are there. And that's also something that is related to identity, of course. On the other hand, you also have a long-term trend in immigration. If people say that immigration doesn't change, they always mean that in the world, on average, about 3% of global population are immigrants. That means that they live in a country different from where they were born. However, while the global share of immigrants doesn't change, the share of immigrants in developed countries has changed a lot, because people move more freely. And you see, for example, when you look at the OECD countries on average, we move in 25 years from 6% to 10%. When we talk about European Union, we move from 5.5% to 11%. So we double share of foreign-born population in those countries. Same in high-income countries on average, and same in the US, where North America, sorry, where you move from 10% to 15%. So it's a major increase. So it's a slow increase, but it's a major increase. But that was also a case of a sharp increase in 2015-16. When you look at asylum applications in the EU, you see a major increase in 2015. Syrians, but not only Syrians, we also talk about Iraqis and other people coming from the Middle East after the violence that erupted in the second decade of the 21st century. So it's a one-off shock, if you want. So before going there, I would just say that results of impact of immigration and populism, these results are not that straightforward. So there are papers which show that if immigrants are not too many and well integrated, then actually populists lose their votes, because people are in contact with immigrants, and you have what's called the contact hypothesis by Gordon Allport. So the contact hypothesis suggests that if immigrants are living next to you, if you interact regularly, if you cooperate, you actually are less likely to accept the stereotypes and prejudices. And so whenever you have immigrants in the range of 1% to 3% of local population, if they're well integrated, there is really an anti-populist effect. If immigrants are many, like in Greek islands, we're talking about more immigrants than locals. If you look at other numbers in some countries, like in some parts of Germany, you see actually a negative effect. Also, if immigrants are in transit and you don't cooperate with them often, there is also a negative effect. And of course, skill composition also matters. But basically, there are lots of papers now which identify causal effect. And there are beautiful identification strategies which use, for example, they predict where exactly the immigrants settled using the previous generations of immigrants from the same country. or there are papers which look at quasi-random distribution of immigrants within a country to localities. And in all cases, you see this lack of one single effect. The effects are different in magnitudes, and the effects are different in direction. Actually, there are effects of where populism grows where immigrants arrive and populism declines where immigrants arrive. So that's not that easy. Let me quickly say a few words about new telecommunications technology. We have a paper which was published in 2021 in the top economics journal, quarterly journal of economics. We mentioned a very important change, which is the growth of internet and especially mobile broadband internet. On the right here, you can see that if you look at the number of active mobile broadband subscriptions per capita in the world, you would have about 4% in 2007 and about 70% in 2018. That's average in the world. If you look at developed and developing countries, this growth is, of course, very impressive in both. And in developed countries, it's now more than 100 mobile subscriptions per person. In developing countries, almost 100. And the whole growth in mobile broadband internet is actually due to mobile broadband internet is mostly about mobile broadband internet, not fixed broadband. Fixed broadband has increased, but not by much. And so the fact that we all have smartphones now or tablets means that we are connected all the time and we can see movies, we can see pictures. And so political communication has changed dramatically. And especially it was the case in the second decade of this century when we had an explosion of social media users. And especially when Facebook changed its interface, added the like button. So it's become a very different political environment. So I'm happy to take questions about this. There are plenty of papers, not just this paper, but this paper is the first paper which looks at the whole world and also in particular in Europe. What we do in Europe, we look at all European elections between 2007 and 2018. So it's 33 countries, about 3 elections per country. We look at 400 subnational regions in those countries. So we have about 1,200 election region pairs. So we have each observation is how many votes in this region this party got. And so we classify the parties into populists and non-populists and so on. And basically what we find is that right-wing populists benefit from the spread of mobile broadband internet, left-wing populists benefit as well. Non-populist opposition doesn't benefit, green parties don't benefit, incumbents also lose. And so basically, the magnitudes are pretty large. So if we move from 0 to 100% coverage by 3G or 4G mobile broadband internet, in this region, where coverage changes so much, the share of populist vote increases by 9 percentage points. And share of left-wing voters increases by 6 percentage points. So remember, this is pretty much exactly how much populists have gained in these 10 years. Now, the reality, of course, is not that territories have changed from 0 to 100. The average territory in 2007 had, in Europe, had about 40% coverage, and in 2018, 90% coverage. So we moved from about here to about here, and so the increase in populist vote share for right-wing populists was more like 4.5 percentage points, for left-wing populists more about 3 percentage points. But that means that mobile broadband internet expansion alone accounts for half of increase in populist vote in Europe. So it's very, very important. So I can speculate about why, but basically the simple answer to that is mobile broadband gives a platform to social media, and social media disseminate anti-elite critical speech disproportionately. It also disseminates false news disproportionately, and I'm happy to take questions about it. So now the implications of populism. What do populists do when they come to power? Well, I mentioned research on left-wing Latin American populists. We know it's really bad when you don't respect macroeconomic constraints. Recently, we also had similar things in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But most modern populists do read macroeconomic textbooks. and do a different job. We even have right-wing Latin American populists. Bolsonaro won an election in 2018 and narrowly lost the election last year. But basically, the recent populists are very different from Latin American populists. We don't really have many macroeconomic crises now. The question is, how do we measure their impact on the economy? So a typical paper on this is, again, a paper by my colleague at Sciences Po, Moritz Schulari, is to create a counterfactual. So you have a Brexit, and you see how British economy was developing before and after Brexit. So now we create a counterfactual, a doppelganger of UK economy. How do we do that? We take a weighted average of similar economies, and we calculate the weights exactly in such a way that before Brexit, doppelganger is behaving like UK economy. And then we consider what would have happened if not for the Brexit. So we look at the counterfactual development after the Brexit. And so this paper gives you this chart. So basically from 95 to June 2016, these are quarterly data, doppelganger and the real UK economy are the same. But then they diverge, and the real UK economy underperforms a lot by about 1 percentage point per year, the counterfactual performance. And so what they also do in this paper, they also look at forecasts, and they show that forecasts were in line with doppelganger, while the actual performance after Brexit was much lower. And so this is something that you can do for not just one country, UK and Brexit, you can do it for all countries. I already showed you the graph of 100 years of populism by Funken, Schularik, and Trebisch. What they do in this paper, for each populist in power, they calculate the counterfactual, and they show that arrival of populists in power is very bad news for economy. GDP, gross domestic product, is lower by 10 percentage points after 15 years in power of populists and the counterfactual. And then they show that populists don't bring any benefits. On average, they don't improve the situation with inequality. They increase protectionism. They undermine quality of judiciary system and media freedom. And moreover, they are less likely to exit in an orderly way. They try to instigate a coup. They try to change the constitution. This is actually a rule rather than exception. So this is this paper, and this paper shows you the difference between actual and doppelganger. So before the arrival of populists in power, the difference is 0, and after that it goes down. It goes down about 1 percentage point per year, and that is actually true for left-wing populists, and that's actually is true for right-wing populists. So for both of them. So that's where we are, and let me conclude. I asked 4 questions in the beginning. I started with definition, and I very much like the definition of Kasmude and Cristobal Rabira Kaltwasser, which is just 2 things: anti-elitism and anti-pluralism. There are also definitions which use nativism, authoritarian tendencies, identity politics. But this definition is the broadest one because it only looks at 2 things: anti-elitism and anti-pluralism. I emphasize that this is probably the minimal definition, because if you just use anti-elitism, that's not good enough. For example, imagine a corrupt government. Political players who say this government is corrupt, we need to get rid of this government. This may be legitimate pro-democratic anti-corruption activists, not necessarily populists. So people who actually want to restore checks and balances may be anti-elite because elites are corrupt and they try to destroy checks and balances. So in that sense, you may need anti-pluralism if you want to arrive at a normal definition of populism. Now, quantification of the change in the 21st century, whatever measure you use, in the first 10 years of 21st century, we had a slow but steady increase, substantial increase, and in the second decade, the increase was much more important. And basically, if you look at Europe, we increased from 10 to 15% in the first 10 years of the century, and from 15 to 25 in the second decade. So it's pretty important. So what are the drivers? We actually find strong evidence for economic factors. We find strong evidence for one-off thing, the crisis of global financial crisis. We find strong evidence for the role of mobile broadband internet. And it's not just the paper that I mentioned. There are also papers which show that if I run a deactivation experiment, just turn off your Facebook for a month and let you come back in a month and compare you to people who used Facebook all the time, you see that turning off Facebook decreases polarization. And that's actually very nice. I didn't talk about the role of social media and populists in disseminating hate speech. There are papers like this as well, but that's a different story. Now, on the role of culture, as I said, on immigration, the results are not obvious. There are very good studies of impact of immigration, which identify causal effects, but these causal effects can go in all directions. So impact of immigration and populism can be identified, but it's highly heterogeneous. And sometimes it goes in one direction, sometimes it goes in the other direction. On the long-term trends, like cultural backlash, that's much harder. And when you look at the work of political scientists and sociologists, sometimes you see descriptive evidence, but if you try to find causal evidence, it's very hard. And the main problem to address is if you look at non-economic factors, you need to explain what has changed in the 21st century. What is so special? And either you talk about communications technology or you talk about economic shocks, which trigger the feeling of economic insecurity and therefore intensify cultural divides. Now, third question is what populists imply when they come to power? The answer is bad news for the economy. And there are exceptions. Trump, before COVID, the impact is more or less zero. Net impact is more or less zero. He deregulated the economy, which was good for economic growth. He lowered taxes, which was good for economic growth. But he also increased trade barriers, and that was bad for American economy. Poland is also a great exception. Economic performance was strong, but it may have been driven by other factors, such as influx of Ukrainian workers before the 2022 war. After that was influx of refugees, but before that we were talking about 1 or 2 million of Ukrainian workers, cheap, skilled labor that really helped Polish economy. Also sensible macroeconomic policy, also global financial cycle, which was beneficial for the Law and Justice Party, and also some reasonable redistribution policies. Their 500 plus policy was actually quite reasonable and reduced inequality and poverty. And there are papers which show that in the regions which benefited most from that program, peace in the second election, the party of Law and Justice in the second election got even more votes. So what should be done? I already mentioned some solutions, like redistribution. I think we also need to think about reconnecting elites and the public. And here you have deliberative democracy. And we've seen many experiments in the 21st century of deliberative democracy, such as Citizens' Assembly. In France, it's called Grand Débat, Great Debates, after Yellow Vest uprisal, but also what's called Economic, Social, and Ecological Convention, where randomly selected people discuss most pertinent issues and give advice to the politicians. And basically, there is a lot of thinking about this, suggesting that mechanisms like this, what's called sortition, random selection of decision makers, of ordinary people, helps to overcome the mistrust between the public and the decision makers. So these are the solutions which may work. Online, we need to use fact-checking and other interventions. This is also what I work on, and I'm happy to talk about this research as well. There are regulations of social media, there are fact-checking interventions that can help. There are nudging interventions that can help. So there are certain things we can do about non-economic factors related to social media. So I'm running out of time. I've talked for for 40 minutes. So let me stop here and take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Guriev.